So hi everyone. So I do believe that now this exam FMG is over and all those who have gone through the e-Gurukul notes before this exam would have been definitely able to do better than anybody else. Because I am just going to discuss the orthopedic questions with you, the topics which have been shared by you all, and I'll tell you where they are located, where they are mentioned in the e-Gurukul notes, the e-Gurukul app. Okay, so let's start with the orthopedic part. I am Dr. Sushil Vijay. I am faculty of orthopedics at DBMCI and these are your FMG recalls. Let's see what all were the questions which were given in your exams. Okay, so let's start with them. Number one, I got to know that there was an image, something like this, which was quite a repeat of your last year questions, and similar kind of image was asked last year also, right? So what exactly is that? Two small shoes connected to each other by a bar. What exactly is that? This is what we call as the CTV splint or the Dennis Brown splint, isn't it? The Dennis Brown splint. Where do we use it? As I said, the CTV splint. So these are used in the children who are having CTV. And when do we use it? So when we discuss the topic of CTV in your classrooms also, those who have been part of my class, you know that the CTV, we discuss that whenever there is a child with CTV, what is the order of correction of CTV foot? The order of correction of CTV foot is simply cave. What does that mean, cave? The cavus has to be treated first, which is there because of the first metatarsal. After cavus, we are going to correct the adduction. This adduction is seen where? This adduction is seen at the forefoot, where there is a medial deviation of the forefoot. That is because of involvement of the which joint? The talonavicular joint. And then we have got the varus correction. Varus is primarily because of the calcaneum, which is shifting medially. So when the part of the limb distal to the joint goes medially, we call it what? Varus. So calcaneum is going medially, that converts or that makes the rest of the foot to goes medially is what you call varus. And at last, we have got equinus. So why do we have equinus? Which joint is involved? In equinus, we know that it is the tibia and the talus which are involved to give the foot the equinus deformity. So this cave has to be the sequence of the correction of foot. And in how many days, in how many plasters should we be able to correct the CTV foot? Usually, 6 to 7 plasters are enough. Usually 6 to 7 plasters are enough, which are changed every 5 to 7 days. Every 5 to 7 days you have to change it. And broadly speaking, so 7 plasters, 7 days, how many days? Around 49 days. So approximately in 2 months span of time, we should be able to correct the CTV foot by plaster application. Now, once you have corrected the foot by plaster application, now what? The child is still a 2-month-old baby. Will he be able to maintain the correction? No. So what we do, once the correction is achieved by manipulation, the plasters and all, what we do is, we will give the child the CTV splint, we simply call as the Dennis Brown splint, where these two shoes are connected to each other by a bar. And the foot which we correct for CTV is always kept. For example, one foot is like this. So the other foot will be kept in extended abduction. That means more of abduction. So why we want to keep the foot in abduction? Because we want to keep the foot in a over-corrected position. We want to keep the foot in over-corrected position. This is our principle of giving this Dennis Brown splint. Over-correction is given in the foot in which you have just corrected the CTV, right? So this is how the CTV shoe or the CTV splint, the Dennis Brown splint is used in the cases of CTV. Right? Till when to give it? This is the snapshot from the e-Gurukul notes, right? Which is almost 90%, 95% a copy of the e-Gurukul videos only. So here you can see, we have very, very clearly mentioned in the splint topic also that Dennis Brown splint is used for CTV, right? Then here in the topic of CTV, we said that the Dennis Brown splint will be used, which will keep the foot in 70 degrees of abduction and slight valgus. And this is what you do when you have achieved the correction by plaster application. Okay, so this was very, very simple question, a straightforward question, though I would say, which has been a repeat of your last few years of exam and has been repeated again in this. So remember, CTV, what all are the components of CTV which are important every time for any of the exam, not only FMG, any of the exam, is the CTV, the 4 deformities which are a part of it. So I've told you the order of correction. So those are the same deformities, the 4 deformities which are a part of it. Then second important thing you should remember, the order of correction. Second thing you should remember from CTV is order of corrections. That has to be same like we just discussed. So that will be same order of correction. Number 3, you should know that this order of correction was given by whom? So this was Pirani who gave this order of correction. This was Pirani who gave this order of correction. Now, once you have achieved the correction, then what to do? Then we have to give the CTV splint, or we simply call as the Dennis-Brown splint, right? We simply call as the Dennis-Brown splint. Once the foot is, initially when you give the Dennis-Brown splint, initially it is worn full time. Full time means out of those 24 hours, he has to wear it all the 23 hours or 23 and a half hours. But gradually, it is only given full time for 3 months only. And then gradually we decrease the time. And once the child starts walking, if we need it, then only given in the night time only, right? Then it's given in night time only. So after that, once the child starts walking, if you feel like that this child still can have some deformity, after this what we use is what you call as the CTV shoes. And other than that, in some of the exam, you may be asked about the angles, what all angles are important for CTV. For example, for cavus, if I tell you with deformities only, for cavus, how do we measure the cavus? Cavus is the high arched foot, isn't it? So that has to be seen from the lateral side of the foot. So from lateral side of the foot, what we see is an angle between talus and the first metatarsal. Talus and the first metatarsal. How much is this angle normally? This angle normally is 0 to 4 degrees. 0 degree to 4 degrees. If the angle goes less than 0 degree, it becomes your flat foot. If the angle goes more than 4 degree, it becomes your cavus, right? This is what we call as the Meary angle, M-E-A-R-Y. This is other name for this angle is Meary angle. And now why I'm saying the angle can be important? Because sometime in your exams, they can ask you that match side A with side B. Match side A with side B. So they can give on side A certain angles, like the angles of spine, like the angle of elbow, like the angle of calcaneum, like the angle of CTV, and they can ask you which condition they are related to. Second, we talked about the adduction. So adduction is again seen in the same X-ray, where you make a line between talus and the first metatarsal, but now this has to be in which view? This has to be in AP view. So cavus will be seen in lateral view, and AP view will give you idea about adduction, axis through the talus and the axis through the first metatarsal. So this is normally 5 to 15 degrees of abduction. This is normally 5 to 15 degrees of abduction. In CTV, what is going to happen? What is expected? It will decrease, right? So that will produce adduction deformity of the foot. That will be related to adduction. Third, we said is varus. So varus means the calcaneum is deviating. So what we measure is the angle between the talus and the calcaneum, which is known as the talocalcaneal angle or the Kite's angle. So in the AP view and the lateral view, the broader range is around 25 to 55 degrees. So if you talk of my right talus, talus is facing like this in the right foot, facing medially, and calcaneum is facing laterally. So what happens in CTV? The calcaneum deviates medially like this and they dip down. They go in plantar flexion. Okay. So the long axis of talus and the calcaneum both are parallel, almost an angle of 0. So this talus calcaneal angle, as I said, in AP view and lateral view, it will be somewhere between 25 degrees to 55 degrees. And what happens in CTV? This again decreases. And last, I said equinus. Now to check the equinus, ideally what happens here, the talus goes down into plantar flexion as a part of CTV. So what do we measure is an angle between the tibia and the calcaneum in the lateral view. Tibia and the calcaneum in the lateral view. And that gives you an idea about increase in the angle. So normally this angle is 10 degrees to 40 degrees. When the talus goes down, obviously the calcaneum will also go down. So accurate angle will be measured not from talus but from calcaneum. So talocalcaneal angle, this is normally 10 to 40, which will increase in CTV. So CTV, what happens is a increase of cavus, the decrease of adduction and varus, and increase in equinus. Okay. So in cavus, angle is increased, adduction and varus, the angle is decreased, and in equinus, it is again increased. These are the parameters. So these are the points that you should always remember for any of the exam you are appearing for, right? So this is from the e-Gurukul notes that I have just shared with you. And for every question, I'll keep on sharing that where you could have find or you could have definitely revised the important things in the e-Gurukul app or the e-Gurukul note. Let's see the second question also. Second question, 35-year-old male with lytic lesion. Okay. So there was an image given. 35 years is the age given. Lytic lesion which erodes cortex of the bone with giant cell in the photograph of pathology. What exactly it is? So they had asked you another question which showed you that there is a 35-year-old male who was having a lytic lesion extending from the epi to the metaphysis. That was a kind of question given. And there was on pathology, there is a giant cell tumor. So when you talk of the giant cell tumor, you know that giant cells are primarily located or seen in histopathologically, in which condition? Histologically, if you see, the giant cell will be seen most commonly, obviously, in giant cell tumor. And the most commonly mimic tumor, which shows you the presence of giant cells, is aneurysmal bone cyst, right? So we know one very, very big difference from the knowledge of our bone tumors, that the giant cell tumor in GCT, if it is a giant cell tumor, then GCT is located where? At epiphysis. We know that because we have discussed that in our classrooms also, in our e-Gurukul also, that how to analyze a tumor. To analyze a tumor, you just have to see the tumor in 3 steps. Step number 1, what is the location of the lesion? So if the location of the lesion is located to your epiphyseal area, you have broadly 2 tumors here, giant cell tumor and the chondroblastoma. If there is a metaphyseal location, then it has to be another 5 or 6 tumors. If it is a diphyseal location, another tumor. So another tumor which has got giant cell tumor, the most commonly mimicked one is ABC. ABC basically occurs where? At metaphysis. And in your question, in your exam, probably it was mentioned, as I came to know from student, that there is a lytic lesion which is extending from epiphysis towards metaphysis. So extending means it is now a what kind of lesion? It is not a benign lesion. It is going into aggressive nature. Okay, so when you talk of the lesion which is going from benign to the malignant category, we know that the epiphyseal tumor, both of them, the giant cell and the chondroblastoma, what kind of nature they have? They have a benign aggressive nature. They're not benign, they're benign aggressive nature. But this giant cell tumor, only in 5 to 10% cases, you can say less than 5% cases, turn up into malignancy. So malignant transformation for giant cell tumor, it is less than 5%. Malignant transformation for giant cell tumor is less than 5%. But now we have got a lesion which is eroding the cortex and which is showing you giant cell pathology. So a epiphyseal lesion which shows me giant cell in the histological examination is only one, that is giant cell tumor. And how do we see this particular image? You can see that the cortex here is broken from the medial side. The joint area is still not breached. It is okay. And there is a expansile lytic lesion. You can all appreciate the epiphyseal area. Right? So lytic lesion, the giant cell tumor. What is the other name for giant cell tumor? You all know? Osteoclastoma. So it has to be a clastic lesion. It has to be a lytic lesion in comparison to the other epiphyseal lesion, which is known as the chondroblastoma. That is supposed to be a blastic lesion. Okay. And how it was seen in our notes, the e-Gurukul notes, the benign aggressive tumor, the heading of that, and we have discussed giant cell tumor. So what we have mentioned here, what is the age group for giant cell tumor? It is 20 to 40. And what was the age of the patient given to you in the exam? The 35 years, ranging. Then second, we said, what exactly is the location? One of the most common location is the knee joint, lower femur or upper tibia. That is one around knee. And the second one is around distal radius. Right? And then we also discussed that rate of malignant transformation is less than 5%. It is less than 5 to 10%. Okay. So expansile lytic lesion located at epiphyseal area, age group 20 to 40, what it can be other than giant cell tumor. Because the age group for, if you talk of the chondroblastoma, the other epiphyseal lesion, the chondroblastoma, the usual age group for chondroblastoma, it is in the skeletally immature age group usually, and that is 10 to 25 years. That is in the immature age group, that is 10 to 25 years. Okay, that is chondroblastoma. So I guess it would have been very, very easy when they have clearly mentioned about giant cell. So I am very much clear, either it is GCT or ABC or other tumors which are mimicking the giant cell tumor. But when they have mentioned clearly that there is a lytic lesion from the epiphyseal going towards the metaphysis, what else it can be other than the osteoclastoma, the lytic lesion. Okay, let's move on to the number 3. Number 3, you had a question is something like this. A person with 1 month history of pain. There is a person who is having a 1 month history of hip pain. Okay. Then there is a true limb shortening. Fine. When there is a true limb shortening, what is that suggestive of? True limb shortening can only happen when the ASIS are at the same level. The concept of true and apparent measurement we have very, very well discussed in our classrooms also, in our app also. What is the meaning of apparent and true shortening? Isn't it? We have discussed that. So when the two ASIS, they are at the same level and then you measure the length of the limb. If now the length of the limb is short, it is true shortening. If now the length of the limb is increased, it is true lengthening. right? So ASIS has to be on the same level. ASIS has to be on the same level, right? So what they're saying, there is a history of hip pain, there is true limb shortening, and it is diagnosed as a case of tuberculosis. So they have already given you the diagnosis. Now they are just asking you which stage it is. So now I told you one very, very easy way to remember in your eGurukul app also, in the classroom also, in the eGurukul notes also, whether it is late arthritis, early arthritis, or synovitis, or advanced arthritis, what it can be. So when we discussed about the stages of tuberculosis of the hip, what are the different stages of tuberculosis? Let's see that. This is a screenshot again from the eGurukul app, the eGurukul notes. So we discussed at the duration of 54.05 in the topic of tuberculosis of the hip joint that the hip is the second most common skeletal site affected by tuberculosis after vertebra. Vertebra remains your most common site. That is what we discussed. And then the other important thing that we discussed in the hip joint was what are the common sites which are involved in tuberculosis of the hip joint. Most common site remains your roof, the acetabulum. Second commonest site, the head of the femur. That means the most common and the second most commonest site are around your joint. That means there is always a tendency that the hip joint may be very well getting destroyed as a part of tuberculosis. Okay, so initially, whenever there is any kind of inflammatory process going on in the hip, the first stage always remains your synovitis. So synovitis, we have very, very clearly discussed on multiple occasions that synovitis, because of any reason, will have the hip move in the same attitude, and that is abduction and external rotation. Why abduction and external rotation? Because in this posture, in this abducted and externally rotated posture, the hip will be having, the capsule will be in its maximum capacity. That will be maximally swollen or open, right? So synovitis because of tuberculosis, synovitis because of septic arthritis, synovitis because of Perthes, or any number of conditions you can name off, any synovitis initially will have the hip in the same posture, that is abduction and external rotation. Now, we discussed in our app, in our classroom, that abduction state, ASI is keeping at the same position. So you measure the limb. But now, whenever the patient tries to abduct the hip, what he will do? Whenever he tries to abduct the hip, what he will do? He will tilt the pelvis down. He will tilt the pelvis down and then try to keep the limb away. That is abducted. This is a midline. This is a midline and this leg is straight. So this abduction deformity seems to be showing that the length of the limb is somewhat increased. But in actual, it is not increased because the patient is trying to keep the hip or the limb away by tilting his pelvis down. That means ASIS is not at the same level right now. So he's just trying to keep the hip away. This means when the ASIS are not at the same level, what we say is that it is an apparent lengthening only. It's not a true lengthening. Okay. So here, the first important thing we should remember, is that the first sign seen, the radiological sign seen on X-ray in the tuberculosis of the hip is nothing is seen in the stage 1 because it is just a synovial inflammation, nothing else. In the stage 2, we call it the stage of early arthritis. Now the bony involvement will somehow start. Early arthritis, when it starts, what it does, it causes the hip to go into adduction and external rotation now because the muscular spasm will happen, the muscle spasm will happen and it will keep on pulling the bone up and towards the pelvic area. So when the hip goes into adduction means the patient will try, the muscles will try to pull the bone up. That means now the ASIS goes at a somewhat higher level as compared to the normal side. So now the hip will be closed to the midline and it seems like that the length of the limb is shortened. But point is, the hip joint is not yet destroyed. There might be some erosions which are visible, but other than a classical osteopenia, the bony destruction is usually not seen in this particular stage. So joint space is still maintained. So when the joint space is maintained, it is only the muscular spasm which is pulling the bone up. And now the ASIS has gone up. So it is kind of compensatory pelvis tilting to keep the limb in this state. So in this stage also, what is the first radiological sign seen? It is osteopenia. The stage 3 we say is late arthritis, where the joint space is finished. So now when you try to measure the length of the limb, what will happen? If the joint space of one side is finished, other side is maintained. Obviously, it is a true shortening. So this is the stage, where we see the loss of the joint space. So our answer from this particular question was, when there is a true limb shortening, it means it is a stage of late arthritis where the joint space destruction has occurred. So this was your stage 3, and the stage 4 is what you call an advanced arthritis or the wandering acetabulum, right? This is a classical stage of complications in tuberculosis of hip. So remember 3 important things. If I just mark 3 important things from this whole slide that you have to remember, the stages of tuberculosis of the hip. 1, you should remember that the common sites involved in tuberculosis. Acetabulum, the head of the femur. Second important thing, the first radiological sign will be seen in the stage number 2, that is osteopenia. Real length shortening, the true length shortening will be seen in stage 3. There is decrease in the joint space. Okay, and wandering acetabulum is a feature of the stage number 4, that is advanced arthritis, or when it is in the stage of complications. So these are usual 4 questions which are asked to you, and this attitude of the hip, it will help you out a lot in finding the answer if wherever the question is given to you, right? So attitude is very, very important. The hip in abduction and external rotation is synovitis. In adduction and internal rotation, it is bony destruction. In abduction or external rotation, it will be something else. So remember the attitude of the hip, and it all comes with a logical thing. Why the attitude of the hip should be in a particular, posture. So everything is with a logic. So when you discuss the basic thing, when you discuss the conceptual things, these things will you always remember. You don't have to mug it up. So there is a concept behind these things. And if you have read it well, if you have been a part of the live thing, definitely I believe that you have been able to easily mark out all the important things in this particular question. Okay. So let's move on to the next one. The next one was a scenario was given, probably a clinical photograph or X-ray was given, and they asked you that which nerve will be involved in this particular case. Okay. So when you see this X-ray and a clinical photo is given, which nerve is most commonly damaged? So what they're trying to show you is, if I just talk about the X-ray, this is the margin of acetabulum. You can very well make it out. And this is the head of the femur. So where the head of the femur is gone, it is gone out of the socket. So once it is out of the socket, it simply means that what case it is? It is a case of a dislocation of the hip. So we know that we are dealing with what? We are dealing with dislocation of the hip joint. So when you talk about the dislocation of hip, we know that it is of 3 types. It can be anterior dislocation, it can be a posterior dislocation, and it can be a central flexure dislocation. So when we talk about these 3 kinds of dislocations, we know that we can easily differentiate them by the posture of the patient's limb. Now, how do we see the posture of the limb in this particular image? You can see that the hip is slightly abducted and the limb is in internal rotation. You can see that the hip joint is in internal rotation. The leg has been moved in. So leg going in, here the foot turning in, the leg overall coming like out. It means it is an internal rotation of the hip. So when there is an anterior, posterior and the central flexure dislocation, adduction is happening and internal rotation is happening. It's a part of your posterior hip dislocation. How do we differentiate between these 3 different dislocations? So see this, a snapshot again from the e-Gurukul note. The lower limb dislocation of the hip joint discussed at somewhere around 1 minute and 5 seconds. So there are 3 types of dislocations we can see. The anterior one and the posterior one and the central flexure dislocation. And this posterior one is usually the most commonest dislocation, which is also known as what? The dashboard injury. When the patient gets an impact on a flexed knee, when the hip and knee are flexed and there is an impact on the flexed knee, then usually the patient has got a tendency for the posterior dislocation of the hip. That's what you call a dashboard injury. So here the attitude will be adduction and internal rotation. The adduction will be adduction. The attitude will be adduction and internal rotation. Now, you know that when you say it is a posterior dislocation, it simply means that the head of the femur has to go back. It has to go on the posterior side. So when the head of femur is going on posterior side, what is the most important structure that you have on the posterior side in the gluteal area? The head will be palpable in the gluteal region. What is the most thickest nerve of the body? It is a sciatic nerve. So on posterior side, the damage can be to the sciatic nerve. Similarly, when somebody comes to you with the anterior dislocation, the attitude would have been the foot is slightly going like this and the limb will be abducted away from the midline. So abduction external rotation is a feature which you see as a part of anterior dislocation. And then the head of the femur will be coming in front. That means the groin area. And in the groin, there are femoral vessels which can be very well damaged as a part of anterior dislocation. If somehow they give you an X-ray sometime when there is a perforation of the acetabulum roof, the head of the femur perforates it and gets into the pelvic cavity. The structure, which can be very well damaged here. This is all the bladder, correct? So this can, when it is going internally, it can damage the bladder, it can damage the urethra, and usually the most commonly injured structure is the membranous part of the urethra as a part of pelvic fractures, the pelvic injuries. Okay, so as a part of central flexure dislocation, it can be urethra or the bladder. So this is what we have discussed, and if you just have recalled the basic, I believe that you have marked it very, very correctly in your exam too. So it is diagnosing it. They have not straightforward asked you that posterior dislocation is there and which is the nerve involved. They have just modified the language just to blend the question, that if a patient is coming with so and so attitude, what is the diagnosis, and if this is the diagnosis, which nerve will be involved. So here the answer was very, very clearly the sciatic nerve, right? So posterior dislocation is related to your sciatic nerve. Okay. Next, other one we had is another question. A person opens eye to pain. Okay. Eye to pain. So eye opening is on painful stimulus with inappropriate words. So he is not telling you very, very clearly the things. There are inappropriate comprehensions, and he flexes to pain on withdrawal basically. So on pain, there is a flexion withdrawal. On pain, on basically giving some painful stimuli, there is a flexion withdrawal by the patient. Find the GCS score. Now, if you recall, in our e-Gurukul, we have discussed very, very clearly, and an easy way to remember the GCS, that whenever you are talking about the GCS, now this is the screenshot from your e-Gurukul note, the Glasgow Coma Scale, we discussed that whenever you talk about the Glasgow Coma Scale, do not say or do not learn it like this, that it is EVM. It is not EVM. It is eye opening, it is best verbal, and it is best motor. The word best is very, very important, because I told you with a very classical example that in our question, this time they have mentioned that there is a flexion withdrawal on painful stimuli. But sometimes they can give you that there is a flexion withdrawal from right side, left side, and there is a no withdrawal or pointing to the site of pain from right side. So pointing to site of pain means this is better score. Withdrawal is a poor score. So now which score should I take? So always remember, whenever we talk about the EVM, we don't say that simple EVM. Remember it like eye opening, best verbal, and best motor response. This is how you have to remember it. Okay. So when they are saying the eye opening is on pain, so it is a score of 2. When they say the patient is not, patient is confused, inappropriate words. So when the patient is using inappropriate words, it is point score is 3. And when there is a flexion withdrawal, it is score 4. So total score would be 9 for our patient. If they say mix up both the things, that there is pointing to the site of pain from right side and flexion withdrawal from left side, what to use? Always the better score. That is why I said the best motor score. So localizes to pain, it would have gone for 5. So then it would have been a score of 10, right? So this is, and another important thing, other than Glasgow Coma Scale, you should also remember from this particular topic for all your other exam as well, that they can ask you the question in relation to cervical spine as well. This is basically the management of polytrauma, where we discuss about the GCS. And as a part of management protocol of this polytrauma, we clearly discuss that all the time the polytrauma should be managed as per the ATLS protocols. What they say? The A, B, C, D, E. The A stands for airway. And airway, remember, the patency of the airway has to be maintained. The easiest way to check for the patency of airway is ask the patient to speak. If he can tell you his name, if the speech, the words are coming out, if the tone is there, it simply means the airway is okay. If my airway is choked, I cannot speak. Right? Simple. So airway with cervical spine immobilization. Remember, it's a very, very important point, the cervical spine immobilization. Sometimes they ask you the question in relation to this also, that the patient is having injury to the cervical spine, and after the injury, the patient develops quadriparesis. Right? What is the first step in the management of this patient? So remember, the first step would be to block the cervical spine. Then and there only. Don't wait for the radiologist. Don't wait for investigation. Don't wait the patient to be taken up for OT. No. Block it there only, whatever is available with you, with the cardboard, with the cervical collar, or whatever is available with you, block the cervical spine. If nothing is available, by your hands, you have to block it. But block the cervical spine. Don't allow the mobilization of the spine. It has to be immobilized. Okay. So one important question from here can be from cervical spine region injury. Other can be from Glasgow Coma Scale, which was asked to you. The other can be, they can give you some scenario that the patient is a case of polytrauma, bleeding profusely, had a head injury, had this injury, that injury, multiple things, and they're trying to divert your attention to some other topic. But Remember this, when there is a mention of the word polytrauma, all the time it has to be mentioned as per the ATLS guideline, and my first step would always be airway. My first step would always be airway. Okay, remember this. So now, next one was a question from with a very, very basic anatomy and physiology of the bones, which I usually start my lecture with, the anatomy and physiology of the bones. So they asked hormone that regulates serum calcium level. So serum calcium level is regulated by which hormone? I hope that it was a very, very simple and basic thing, a compilation or a combination of physio plus orthopedics, you can say, the physiology in orthopedics. Which hormone helps in regulation? So this is again from your e-Gurukul notes, what we have discussed there, the regulation of the calcium and phosphate metabolism. It is by three important factors: the parathyroid hormone, the vitamin D3 and the calcitonin. So how does parathyroid hormone helps? Intestine, there is no direct effect, but on kidneys, it increases the conversion of vitamin D to active form, and in bones, it is the resorption of the bones. So that, why resorption of the bones? So that it can maintain the serum levels. So anyhow, if the patient is having a decrease in the serum calcium, for example, in which condition? We discussed the disorder when the patient can have a decrease in calcium, for example, in rickets. So whenever there is a child who is suffering from calcium deficiency rickets, in that particular child, there will be a raise in parathyroid hormone. Why? Because it is trying to maintain the serum calcium level. By these effects, it will not allow the resorption, it will not allow the excretion from the kidneys or the intestine, or it will just absorb from the bones to maintain the serum levels. Okay, so this is again somewhere around 39 minutes of the cell markers in the basic anatomy and physiology of the bones. This is what we have discussed there, right? Which type of collagen is found in cartilage? Again, I repeat, the focus in our classroom is on the collagen which is found in the bones. But yes, when we discussed about the basic anatomy and physiology, the basic composition of the bone, the topic is composition of the bone. We discussed that the bone is made up of three components broadly. One, the organic matrix, one is inorganic mineral, and other is water. So in the organic matrix, we have got cells, and the only cell, the main cell of the bone is always the osteoblast. And this osteoblast secretes a protein which is known as the collagen, which is the type 1 collagen. This type 1 collagen is found in multiple things, and when they this is the type 1 collagen is present at multiple locations. For example, we talk about the bones. It is present in bones. It is present in eyes, the sclera. It is present in teeth. It is present in the ligaments, right? But they have asked you about the type 2. Where is type 2? So we mentioned along with that, the type 2 collagen is found in cartilage. The type 2 collagen was a part of your cartilage. So type 2, remember this, whenever they ask you about the cartilage, it is a type 2. The bone, the eyes, the teeth, the ligaments, the joints, all these are having the type 1 collagen. And this type 1 collagen is secreted by blast only. And that is why this osteoblastic activity can be easily assessed by the collagen also. If there is an increase in collagen, type 1 collagen, we know that the blasts are doing more of an activity. Okay, so again a part of your e-Gurukul notes, again a part of your classroom teaching, again a part of your normal discussion that we had. Okay, let's move on to the next one. A patient from Bihar, and he's a patient from Bihar and presents with teeth and skeletal images shown. So there was I came to know that there was an image given which was kind of skeletal sclerosis. So most likely cause. So what were the causes of sclerosis that we discussed? The causes of sclerosis that we discussed was somewhat like this in our classroom. So a patient is coming from Bihar. What are the causes in children and what are the causes in adult? So a common case in adult and in a child is a fluoride. And when they have mentioned about the teeth, you know that the fluoride can very well decay the teeth like this. So these are the conditions which can produce whiteness on the x-rays. That's what you call sclerosis on x-rays. So whenever we have anything like sclerosis on x-ray, we know that something is wrong with the bones. To have a normal architecture, the osteoblastic and osteoclastic activity should go in coordination, that we usually discuss, like the normal cell regulation. Whenever the blast and clast are working in coordination, there will be proper, the proper trabeculae pattern. The cortical sclerosis will be normal. The blackening of the cancellous areas will be seen, which is normal thing, and with the appearance of or the presence of a trabeculae. So if you can see trabeculae all healthy, you know that the bone is healthy. The blast and clast are working in coordination. But now when it is more of a sclerosis, then we have to think of one of these causes, which are the common things which can be a part of any of the exam. And if I mark from these causes of sclerosis, the commonly asked question, they can be one from fluorosis, one can be Paget's, one can be avian, other can be renal osteodystrophy, which produces what kind of sclerosis? This renal osteodystrophy, it presents with the rugged Jersey spine. Remember that? The rugged Jersey spine. Do you remember the rugged Jersey spine? What was that rugged Jersey spine? So rugged Jersey spine was the sclerosis which was adjacent to the end plates, something like this vertebra. So sclerosis here and here. And what was the picture of vertebra in Paget? It was sclerosis from all around, like this, right? That is one big difference. This is what you call in Paget as ivory vertebra, right? The white vertebra or the ivory vertebra, or the other better name, the picture frame vertebra. This was picture frame vertebra. So rugged Jersey spine is sclerosis only upper end and lower end. Ivory vertebra will be all four margins are sclerotic, right? So this was from causes of sclerosis in vertebrae or in the skeletal system. Other condition we had, the patient presenting with middle finger in extension after some operation. Some surgery was done and the patient is having the finger extended. He is not able to flex it. What possible structure is injured? Now what they did, they said either the nerve is injured or the flexor pollicis is injured, flexor digitorum superficialis or the profundus is injured. So just to, simplify the things, if the particular tendon is injured, for example, let's say any tendon is injured, FDP or FDS, we know that the FDP will be flexing your large joint here. FDS will be flexing your this joint. So if either of the two tendon is gone, only one of the flexion power should be gone. Only one of the flexion property should be gone. Why both? So if FDP is injured, patient will be having the finger like this. He will be able to flex here, but not here. If the FDS is injured, the patient will be having a flexion here, large joint, but not here. But one of the flexion will be preserved. Flexor pollicis longus obviously is of thumb. It has nothing to do with the finger. If some surgery has been done here in the hand, in the finger, something, so that means simply the nerve has been injured. The exclusive supply for this middle finger usually is your median nerve. Usually. So 1, 2, 3 and 3.5, it is all median nerve. This can sometimes have a divided supply, no doubt about it. But when they are saying that certain tendon is gone, it is not matching with the criteria. So this is what they are trying to find out, or what they have confused you is with the pointing index sign. Remember that? So ask the patient to flex all the fingers and this index finger is straightened. Ideally, this should be like this because both are the supply of the median nerve. So patient won't be able to flex any one of them. That's what we call the Ochsner clasp sign, something like this, or the pointing index sign, right? So this is probably an injury to the median nerve because of which the patient is not able to flex the finger, which we simply call as the pointing index sign, the screenshot from your e-Gurukul notes, right? The pointing index sign. And these are the other important things which I expect each one of you to remember from the e-Gurukul app. The nerves, these are all the classical, signs, the classical things which you should always remember. MCQs, the highlighted ones are the, MCQs which can be part of median nerve injury or the ulnar nerve injury. Okay, so it is pointing index sign, also known as Ochsner clasp sign, or the Benedict Pope hand sign. Means the Pope, how does he greet people? The Pope greets people like this. So when you ask the patient to flex all the finger, the supply of the median remains extended. The other two, ulnar one, they will get into flexion. This is how the Pope greets people. So that's also known as the Pope hand sign or the Benedict hand sign, or the Ochsner clasp sign. Ask the patient to flex all the fingers, they remain extended, or the pointing index sign like this. Okay, so this is from the e-Gurukul notes. Another one we had, a alcoholic patient slept with compression around his arm and had injury to the radial nerve. Most likely this is what kind of injury? So there is no specific injury, there is only compression injury, and this is just a physiological block. For example, when you sit for a long time and you are in a habit of sitting for, with a cross leg. So what can happen is the upper leg, it starts giving you some tingling, some numbness. So upper leg starts getting into tingling. So this tingling sensation in the leg is because the nerve, the CPN has been compressed. Once you relieve the pressure, it is fine. Same thing is happening here. The patient was drunk, he slept on some chair, some compression happened, and now what kind of injury is this? This is just a physiological conduction block. What do you call it? This is what you call neuropraxia. So most commonly, what kind of injury and which classification? Again, from your e-Gurukul notes, the basics of the peripheral nerve injury. The basics. So what are the basics? Basic is the classification of the nerve injury, the Seddon and the Sutherland. The Seddon and the Sutherland. So how did we divide the nerve injury as per Seddon's classification? The neuropraxia, exontemesis and neurotemesis. So neuropraxia means a physiological conduction block for which the treatment is very, very simple. Just wait and watch and give the splint support. You just need to give the splint support. Once you give the splint, it is absolutely fine. right? So axontomesis means injury to the axon plus minus its overlying layer, that is endoneurium. And neurotomesis means a complete transaction of the nerve. So it is not a complete transaction. We don't need to go for surgery here. It is just an alcoholic patient who has slipped or with a compression on the radial nerve. What will happen to him? He'll recover. How much chances are there? 100%. When he will recover, we don't know, but gradually, yes, it will recover. What we need to do, we just need to give a splint support, right? So that's a kind of neuropraxia. And if I tell you the simple word for this particular kind of injury, what do we call it? The Saturday night palsy. Remember that? The Saturday night palsy. Alcoholic, drunk, sitting with the arm over a chair, hanging like this. Next day, the arm is not working. Okay, so compression of the brachial plexus. What kind of injury? The neuropraxia. So this is neuropraxia, which will recover 100%. Okay, so these were certain questions which were shared by the student, the topics which were shared by the students after the FMG exam. So I wish you all the very, very best for the result. And I do believe that if you had your concepts clear, if you have been able to revise these notes or have been able to watch the videos, the highlighted points, the LMRPs from the e-Gurukul, I do believe that definitely you are going to go through, right? So building concepts, as I always say, building the basics and the concept is the key, not only for the FMG, but for any of the exam. Nobody is there who is going to ask you a hi-fi thing, right? One or two questions you can exclude it. It's, it's same for everybody. But all the 99.99% paper is basically based on the basics, the concepts. And now once we see that more of the clinical kind of questions are being asked, then we know that the clinical scenarios will be more often in the coming years also. So I just want you to pass on this message to your juniors, to your other colleagues who are going to give the exam next time, that please build up your basics and the concept. Building the basic is the key. Please, I have seen people, mugging the things up. Please don't try to mug up the things. This will not at all help. I can assure you on that. You don't have to mug up just one subject. If you try to mug up, you have to mug up all the 19 subjects. And if you build up the concepts, believe me, your subjects will be integrated automatically. Out of these questions also, if you see the injury to the nerve, right? Injury to the dislocations, the injury to the sciatic nerve, these are a part of your anatomy class also. So when you try to build up your concepts, when you try to build up your basics, this will automatically integrate the subjects for you, and things will be pretty much easier when you're preparing for the any of the entrance exam. Okay, so please, my advice to everybody who is going to give the exam next time, who is preparing for the exam for next time, please don't mug up the things. There is a reason for everything, and we medicos are supposed to know the reason. We are student of science. We are not supposed to mug up the things. We are supposed to learn the things. We are supposed to, understand the basic concept why this happened. So this why should be with us for any of the subject, any of the content that you are reading. Do not try to mug up. I'm telling you, this will not help you out. Okay. So please learn the concepts. Please learn the basic things. Try to integrate the different subjects. And that's all you need to crack any of the exam. Okay. So my best wishes with you. Thank you so much for being a part of it. And for any kind of academic assistance, you can anytime reach to us anytime you want. We'll be happy to help you out. Okay. So thank you so much, guys. Thank you.